Okay, so we're continuing our discussion of the Bracero program during World War II. And we had discussed how, upon recruitment and acceptance into the Bracero program, they were sent to the processing centers in the southwest part of the United States. The depictions here of them being recruited. Here's a picture of their mistreatment, being deloused with DDT powder, and they felt it was very dehumanizing, in other words. And evidently, exploitation continued even as they were sent to their respective farms throughout the United States. Now, there were guarantees for these workers that were part of the negotiation, and indeed, they were placed in each individual contract for the workers. But according to Bracero testimony, individual testimonies, right, it was quite commonplace that these rights and guarantees were not enforced. They were supposed to be in place on behalf of the Mexican workers, but again, they were not observed all the time. For example, some claim that right when they get there, right, they're specifically designated for only agricultural work, but then they're sent to work as a janitor or to lay down irrigation pipes or to operate machinery, even to clean the streetcars of the city. So here it's obviously the case of, exploitation of these workers to assign them to these jobs outside of the specified field of agriculture. Now, even their living conditions, it was mentioned by those interviewed that even though they're supposed to have these suitable living conditions for them in the United States, well, oftentimes these conditions were quite ramshackled, unsanitary. Sometimes it was just a converted barn or a chicken coop, you know. And by the way, some of them even occupied former camps that held the Japanese during World War II, okay? The internment camps. So there were these military-style barracks and living conditions. Moreover, the food, many complained about the food. In fact, many got poisoned, food poisoning, which was quite common because the employers would try to cut corners on the food expense, and they would serve like rancid food and spoiled food. And there's no real regulatory control practiced by the U.S. government to protect the workers, despite the fact that, let's remember, they're guest workers in the United States. They were deemed to be highly, desirable labor. Okay, but again, they're not treated as such. Other exploitations that took place was the deduction in their paychecks for many of them. There were some legitimate deductions that took place in the Bracero paycheck, and this is according to contract, things like insurance and a little bit for boarding. However, there were some illegal deductions that also took place for things like transportation and blankets and warm clothing and even farm tool expenses. And also their pay schedule was often unpredictable. It depended on the grower, right? And also when they were paid the wages, many were supposed to be paid a definite wage according to contract. But oftentimes what they were paid or when they were paid was unpredictable. There was a question here from the employer's perspective: should we pay the worker by the piece or by the hour? And this would fluctuate every pay period depending on the grower's advantage. They took advantage of which was more financially advantageous to them, the grower, and therefore the worker oftentimes were left out of deserved wage. And let's remember that according to that contract, you have to send the remittance to Mexico. In fact, it was required that 80 to 90% of the wage be automatically sent back to Mexico as a form of remittances to their families. So that means the money that was left over after that remittance, well, it was barely enough for subsistence for them as a wage worker and a guest worker, right? So these were the numerous Bracero complaints against their exploitation. And there's still even more. If you even try to complain or protest the exploitation that was occurring, well, you were promptly fired. Why? Because it's easy to replace you with another bracero. Moreover, they had no real bargaining power and therefore no means of, protesting these conditions. So that was their plight and their predicament in the West. The bracero program was, again, a condition of differential inclusion when you think about it. They're highly valued as a labor force. In fact, they're needed, yet they're also treated as if they're not wanted. And again, this is despite the fact that they're deemed to be a valuable guest worker labor force that's absolutely necessary to maintain the food supply in the United States for Americans during this crisis of World War II. So now we could begin to discuss this notion of the construction of the quote-unquote illegal alien. Okay, and the argument being made here is that the so-called illegal alien problem was actually created by U.S. agribusiness and with full knowledge of the U.S. government here. And the attempt here was to undercut Mexico's bargaining power over the bracero contract workers. So how does this work out? Okay, first of all, let's remember that in the beginning, as I mentioned, migration across the border was very fluid and it was not even regulated. And as mentioned in the early 20th century, you didn't even require a visa or a passport to cross the border. Okay, it was not policed, not regulated. But during the bracero program, you had undocumented braceros there from the beginning of this program. Why? Well, it involved those who didn't pass the screening, right? Remember, they were first sent to the recruitment centers, and then they were screened at the processing center if they were accepted, right? But there were some who didn't pass the screening. But they were still deemed as a potential work labor force, those who didn't pass. Why? Because American growers realized they could pay them even less than they paid the braceros. The braceros, they have to pay according to the contract, even though, as I mentioned, it was quite precarious and unpredictable, right, and for some. But for the undocumented braceros, they could pay them as long as the bracero who's undocumented and not part of the program, the unofficial bracero, if you will, as long as they accepted it, right? And often they would be paid as low as $1.50 an hour. So that was, back then, considerably less than the official bracero. Okay, now let's go back to Texas. As we mentioned, Texas was blacklisted from receiving Mexican bracero workers. Why? Because Texas openly practiced discrimination against ethnic minorities. You had Jim Crow alive and well during this time. But at the same time, Texan growers and farmers needed their braceros, and they decided they could take advantage of the undocumented persons who didn't pass the screening. So therefore, they began to encourage undocumented migration. And needless to say, they hired them if they're able to make it to the United States. And meanwhile, the government got word of this, that it was happening, but the government turned a blind eye to this practice, basically. Now, at one case that is really eye-opening is the so-called El Paso incident in 1948, as mentioned here. And this was a case whereby the Texas-Mexico border, right there in El Paso, was opened by U.S. immigration officials to enable thousands of undocumented workers to enter South Texas and to work as undocumented laborers for American growers. And let's remember that Mexico did not allow Mexican nationals or Mexican citizens to Texas. So this was in defiance of that mandate put forth by Mexico. This is despite Mexican government regulation against sending Mexican citizens to Texas. And interestingly enough, as the flow of undocumented workers, and again, I said thousands, crossed the border during this time that was open, even the Border Patrol processed them and escorted them in some cases to the farms. Okay, so this is full collaboration with the U.S. Border Patrol, and thus began this informal practice, of using undocumented labor. It was now formalized here. There was now the full knowledge that you could find a job by some American employer, whether it's agribusiness or perhaps other enterprises, as long as you managed to cross the border. Now, there was even acquiescence among American cabinet level officials at this time, acquiescence of the undocumented Mexican worker. For example, I just mentioned the Border Patrol, but even the Department of Labor was fully aware. But again, this is in betrayal of that formal agreement made with the Mexican government. Okay, so basically growers in other states, not just Texas, began to employ undocumented Mexicans, the so-called illegal alien, due to labor needs. And indeed, American growers would even tell the official braceros, who were officially part of the program, to spread word back to Mexico that jobs awaited them, even if they were undocumented. So hence the massive increase in undocumented migration at this time. Now, by the 1950s, with the Cold War, you see nativism spike again, especially in the West. Why? It's becoming agitated due to this flow of undocumented aliens. And it fed into the fears of, this invasion happening in the United States, this racial invasion. So you see this bureaucratic struggle between the Department of Labor, who actually wanted to prolong undocumented migration. They're struggling over this question of undocumented migration of Mexicans. They're struggling with another department, the INS and the Attorney General, who wanted to stop it. And the INS is the Immigration and Naturalization Services. So the government meets this dilemma with a two-pronged strategy. Okay. On one hand, they will institute something called Operation Wetback. And this is a case where 1.2 million Mexicans would be apprehended and sent back to Mexico. Okay. But what they did as a compromise is doubled the legal work visas for braceros. They doubled the number of allowable braceros to come over. So by the 50s and 60s, you see 450,000 braceros migrate annually. So look at that. It's a compromise. You have Operation Wetback, as they called it, which is a dragnet again, a sweeping campaign to repatriate. But the other side of the compromise is to extend the number of braceros in the United States compared to the original agreement that was forged in the 1940s. So this is what happens during Operation Wetback. You see undocumented and U.S. citizens, by the way, rounded up, expatriated, sometimes under grueling conditions. Some were just dropped off near the border and therefore died of heat stroke in the desert. And ultimately, this was criticized as more of a publicity campaign to appease nativists. This is something we're aware of today, right? In current events, publicity campaigns, right, of a particular cause. Well, this is how that was framed, as a publicity campaign to appease nativists. So ultimately what happens is by the 1980s, you see the increasing militarization of the border.